Mike Rea is a self-professed bad scientist and bad musician, but despite and perhaps even because of those limitations, he's built some pretty good companies. As CEO of Idea Pharma and Protodigm, he makes the distinction between the invention of a drug in the lab and the level of innovation in its development. Although he compares the work to that of a CRO, he clarifies that it's really a bit upstream from there. And in the future, if you hear Protodigm start talking about being a pre-RO, you'll know that that little brainstorm came out of this podcast. Mike runs a record company too, and it's aptly named Medical Records. He also hosts his own book club/podcast about innovation in pharma. I'm David Williams, host of the Health Biz podcast and president of Health Business Group, a strategy consulting firm that helps healthcare and life sciences companies like Idea and Protodigm develop robust growth plans. Reach out to me, dwilliams@healthbusinessgroup.com, if you'd like to discuss strategy for your company. Oh, and please do me a favor and hit the subscribe button. Great. Well, Mike Rea, CEO of Idea Pharma and Protodigm, welcome to the Health Biz podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
We want to hear all about what you're doing today, but I also want to hear about what brought you to this point. And I'd love to hear about what your childhood was like, any early influences that set you on your way.
It's one of those boringly nice childhoods, right? So I grew up in the northeast of England, Newcastle, which I think is mostly famous in the US for its beer.
Yeah.
Nice, steady, growth. I think the biggest issue probably for me was trying to find where to apply my energy, right? So I did a lot of things, comic books, writing, sports, a lot of sports. So, healthy, cold and wet, as you'd expect from the northeast of England. So.
Good. All right. So it's just your classic upbringing and results. So we can just trace that along the way. Now, what did you study in school?
So in England you do a breadth. I specialized typically in science and languages. So I dropped arts pretty quickly, much to my regret. Now in middle age. I went, so school is broad and then you start specializing down. I went to university at 18 in the UK and studied genetics, which, for me was, and this was the mid 80s, right? So the mid 80s was a time of, I'm going to say, incredible promise for genetics and biotechnology.
Yeah.
The school that I went to, I chose because it was the best in the UK at biotechnology. Unfortunately, I still had the legacy of, I'm going to say, Mendelian, plant genetics, growing up through that way, and that stuff bored me. Terribly.
The monks have a way of asserting their influence across the centuries.
Exactly. Yeah, it's you can't escape it. University was great, right? So clearly, I was studying something I liked doing. I liked genetics, but I continued my distraction. I set up an American football club when I was at university in the UK, and then spent more time on that, I think, than on my studies. And then we set up the UK American Football League while I was there. So again, more distractions. I was writing fiction. So all of the distractions of university meant that I didn't get the degree that I wanted at university.
There you go. So it's like a story of things that you have these little regrets early on that maybe you can make up for in the later years. So
or you pivot. And I think that's the story. Serendipity and pivoting.
Now, what did you do career-wise before becoming a CEO?
So the good thing about getting a bad degree, if that makes sense, was that I didn't go into research. I went into I kind of combined the streams of writing and language and went into publishing, so science publishing, quickly after university, and then found myself happily in specializing in the pharmaceutical space in journal publishing, and then realized that there's a whole world of strategy sitting there that you could never have, gone to a careers advisor about at school. They wouldn't have known it existed, but what a sweet spot existed as soon as it was open.
Now, Idea Pharma, you're CEO there. Now,
Yeah.
what is that?
So we talk about it as a path to market strategy group. So kind of classic use case would be that you have an asset, a molecule, early phase, and and inevitably there are questions about where to take it. There are, which indication, what kind of benefit proposition are we going to study, what label might we get, even things like, what's the commercial proposition. So we've built a business based on providing that kind of advice, but also creative input to the kind of decisions that get made along the way. So it's we talk about invention. So we separate out invention, which is coming up with the molecules in the first place. We don't do that. Innovation is something that we focus on very hard, and that for us is about the creation of value from what's in your pipeline, and we take that very seriously.
Now, is IDEA an acronym? I notice it's all capital letters.
We have reverse engineered some acronyms into it.
They call that a backronym.
Exactly. Yeah. Um, yeah. It's one of those things. Often the stories are told in reverse instead of forwards.
Yeah.
Yeah. Strangely enough, it wasn't capitalized for a while. It actually grew out of an idea when we started of idea farming. So the idea of propagation and hybridization and so forth of ideas. So and then we kind of forgot about that over time.
Got it. Yeah, it's one of those things that sticks out. Sometimes you have something that originally is a word that doesn't make sense, like MCI was like Microwave Communications Incorporated, and then it's just MCI or CVS. I think it was Consumer Value Stores, and so
Yes.
they
Yeah.
eventually you want to get get rid of that one. So,
Yeah.
but IDEA makes sense. It looks like IDEO, which you probably don't want it to do, but it's
Yeah, yeah. I think some people have confused us over time. I mean, they're in the innovation space too, so but they're bigger and more successful than we are. So I don't mind that.
yeah, fair enough. Okay, so you have IDEA, but then now you've got one that is definitely not an acronym,
Yeah,
Protodigm.
yeah.
And is that a separate company, or how does it
Yes.
relate to Idea Pharma? Because you're running both.
Yeah. Well, so one is linked. I mean, they're linked because of the kind of core insight of what we've seen over the time that we've been doing the advisory work with IDEA is that there's a lot of opportunity for pharma to think differently in early phase. So Protodigm was set up to the side of IDEA, really. So I'll take you back. So IDEA, typically we put a range of ideas on the table for a client about how they could take a product to market. And as you'd imagine, there's a stuff in the middle that's pretty conservative. There's a stuff that sits out to the left and to the right. And often, frustratingly, we see companies choose the stuff in the middle, the conservative stuff in the middle. But
Yeah.
mostly not because of risk or appetite. It's just because there's no evidence for the stuff that sits out to the left, and that's not a problem. I mean, you can go and get it. You can go and look for that evidence. So we use the metaphor. It's a little bit like a dark street with one street light. Everyone stands under the street light, thinking that's all there is, or a little bit nervous to get outside of that bright spot. But out to the right and the left, and maybe all this kind of interesting stuff to take a kind of flashlight to and look at. So we said, well, actually, if we can come back quickly with evidence, come back quickly with some ways of finding out whether these ideas are possible, whether they're desirable, would that be attractive? So really, we've created Protodigm as a kind of what we call a next generation CRO to focus on what we're calling pre-decision pathways. So let's accept that you know nothing about a molecule in early phase. Let's at least close some of those loops and give you some evidence with which to make a decision when you need to make one.
I want to come back to something that you mentioned before. I think you were drawing a distinction between invention and innovation.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think about
Yeah,
when I think about coming up with a new pharma molecule or something that is a new invention, it's novel
yeah,
by its nature. That's kind of what they do, and it is used typically, um, to mean just the same thing as like that makes the whole thing as innovative. But I think you're drawing a distinction
mm-hmm.
between you came up with
Yeah,
something that may be totally novel, but now you're gonna develop it in a completely unoriginal and uninnovative way while still calling it it novel. So I'm sensing that, but if you can maybe just get into that a little bit more, it would be great.
Yeah, no, it's a really important distinction to pull out. That we created something called the Pharmaceutical Innovation Index about 10 years ago, and every year we publish that now in Fortune magazine, and it's a ranking of which of the top 30 companies is best at bringing value to their pipeline. So taking stuff from the pipeline through to the market, and then having physicians want to write prescriptions and patients want to take it. Because the question that we asked ourselves is, if you gave the same asset, the same molecule to two different companies at the beginning of phase one, would they be equally successful?
Yeah.
And everyone knew the answer was no.
Uh-huh.
And we thought, well, actually, the more interesting question is why. Um, and we went back to the classic definition of innovation, which is return on invention. So it's the creation of value from your invention. And we see this a lot in pharmaceuticals. Typically there is a head-to-head horse race. There are two molecules, so everyone focuses a lot on the novelty of what comes in, but then they don't focus on the novelty of how they're adding value to that process. So we have pulled innovation and invention apart for our industry, just to say, look, the hard yards are on the innovation. It's like a classic story about the light bulb and Edison. Is there's like 21 different people could have claimed to have invented the light bulb, but we remember Thomas Edison as the innovator because he was the one that made it work. He was the one that put the infrastructure in place and so forth. So and did the 1,000 material kind of
Yeah.
evaluation, and that's the kind of thing that we're excited about at Protodigm is finding the bamboo filaments or the whatever to make the early phase work meaningful.
So you said before that it's clear everybody would say, yeah. Now that you mention it, you give a molecule to one company at the end of phase one and another one, and they're going to do differently, but it's not always clear,
Yeah.
why. But are there some things that you would put in there, sort of like the innovation drivers versus the things
Mhm.
that really kind of hurt innovation? Are there some general principles or things that you tease out from your own work, or that that are observable in the market?
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, culture is important. I think organized teams, we tend to talk about affinity groups. So people that are good at, therapy areas tend to do better than people that are operating outside of this sweet spot. So, for example, a Gilead and antivirals would be a, great case of a leadership that knows what they're doing and a kind of portfolio that they can pull through. And some of that tacit stuff, the kind of stuff that leadership knows without needing to learn from a slide deck in 6 months' time. That kind of thing makes a big difference. But the big thing is, how quickly and how well the opportunity was characterized early. So, a great recent example of a head-to-head horse race was Keytruda, Opdivo, and everything else in the immuno-oncology space.
Yeah.
And if you look at the curves of who made what in that space, Opdivo made the early running. Generated $6 billion more than Keytruda in the first 3 years. The curves only just overlapped in terms of revenue, cumulative revenue at the end of 2020, even though Keytruda's done really, a lot better in the last couple of years. But they're the only two that have made anything. They're the only two above water in that world. Everyone else is underwater in terms of R&D spend and commercial spend versus revenue. So you say, well, what was it about their ability to see early an opportunity? And you go, well, people made those decisions. They made the decisions about, what to focus on, which indications, whether to back hunches or not, how to study them. So I think a lot of that decision making that's the real superpower, I think, for companies going forwards is, how quickly you can enable good, great decision making on the way through. And sometimes, sometimes it's luck. Sometimes you need to develop it. Sometimes it's about organizational capability.
I've heard you use the term, or Protodigm using the term asymmetric
Mm.
learning. Sounds like
Yeah,
asymmetric warfare, but maybe in a more positive way.
yeah,
I mean, what
yeah.
does that mean in the context of pharma and biotech? What kind of symmetry do we typically have in learning, and why do we need asymmetric versions of it?
Yeah, so the view, I think the future goes to those people that can learn faster, right? And that's the core of the Protodigm proposition. So you say, well, if the superpower is going to be how our organizations learn about the opportunity, then we have to learn faster than the other folks what the opportunity really is. So the asymmetry we think is fundamental for any one organization is to say, well, how are we going to do that? How are we going to learn where the opportunity really lies? And I think there's two ways that the industry works: the kind of the McKinsey-like way of trying to treat everything the same way, or you apply all of the ways of thinking to that one asset or to that one opportunity, and then you look for what that the other guys don't. And that is the difference in companies. Might be down to the people that you have internally, might be who you go and ask outside, but might be about which studies you do. But this, driving the asymmetry into the process, the reality is innovation is mostly about decisions. We tend to say, look, the molecule that you have in the lab that you discover and the molecule you launch, they're the same thing. The only thing that separates them is what you learned along the way, what you were able to prove, and so forth. So and as soon as you see that kind of framing, you see, well, then we have to focus on how we learn and, and the methods that we apply to the process.
What is the appetite for sort of, innovation within pharmaceutical development? I often hear people say that, they'd like to try all these different things, but really they have to do it because the reviewer, the agency is going to say this, that, or the other. I mean, do people say that? And then is it the case? And how do you get around it?
We see huge innovation at the regulatory side. So the question would be, do we have an innovative industry that's inhibited by its regulators, or is it a conservative industry that blames the regulators for it? I think it's the latter, right? So in areas like neuroscience, in digital, we've seen the regulators, step ahead of the industry. But there's a bunch of anchors to the way the industry behaves. There's the incentive structure. There's the way that you get rewarded for moving things through the pipeline, even if what you're going to do with them is going to not result in a particularly commercially valuable prospect. One of the things that we've seen is companies are still launching drugs which go no way towards making their own R&D costs back, never mind the R&D costs of the agents that they didn't launch.
Yeah.
So we're often launching pretty weak drugs into a marketplace and then saying that was what the regulators asked us for. But there's a great insight. A few years back, we were talking with a discovery scientist at one of the major pharma companies about a particular pain drug. And he had worked on this drug in the lab and seen it through into essentially proof of concept. I was chatting with him about that and said, look, where is it? And he said, oh, it's in an osteoarthritis proof of concept. And this drug, I'm not, as you know from my university time, I'm not a great scientist. But I said, well, actually, this is a heat pain drug, and it's in an osteoarthritis proof of concept. Are there any of those receptors in the joints? He said, no. So how is it going to work? He said, well, it won't. So why is it in an osteoarthritis proof of concept? He said, well, because when we asked our internal regulatory people how you get a pain indication, they said you do an osteoarthritis proof of concept. I said, well, that's nonsense. That's the wrong question, and certainly the wrong answer. Because that's how you might usually do it, but it's not how you do it for this drug. And it was a great insight into the way that organizations can make bad decisions, through the best of motivations. Those regulatory people needed a different, how could we get this drug to a place on the market, not just how do people usually do it. So, that kind of mindset, I think, it needs to be shifted. And I don't think we're as constrained by regulators as we think we are.
Years ago, I had a similar conversation with a regulatory person at a big pharma company. And at the time, the FDA was talking about quality by design. Really, they sort of need to understand from an R&D standpoint what you're doing. So when you do manufacturing, you don't need to do all these checks because you actually understand fundamentally how it works. And I said, how come you're not applying that here? And he said, well, Janet Woodcock's not reviewing our application. It's going to be somebody down in the thing. And they called that podium policy. She says something. Now,
Right.
she's maybe on the outs now, but she says something, but it doesn't actually trickle down. Is that fair?
Yeah, no, I think you get shifts and you get waves, and we saw that with COVID, and we'll see it with other kinds of therapy. But I think that it's wrong to apply general rules to specific situations, and that's what we have when we're looking at assets. And I think if you think about often you're allowed to get the thing that you ask for, right? So it's a bit like going to court and making an argument with your with your lawyer. You got to be asking for something very specific, and if what you want is to have a general label that allows you to be used by all people with rheumatoid arthritis, that's fine. The people, you'll be sent in one direction. Then if you want a very specific population of rheumatoid arthritis patients, well, that's an easier hurdle in many ways. It's a smaller thing to aim at. What people tend to do is they tend to trade off. Well, look, we'd kill our market opportunity if we did that, or we'd kill, something else. But sometimes you made the studies easier, you made them faster. The regulators will go with your argument that you've, and if you go far enough back upstream, you say, well, actually, if we were able to take a biomarker into the study, if we were able to, offer a precision medicine opportunity, you do that thinking early enough, suddenly everyone's happy, the regulator's happy, you've proven your case, you've enriched the population, the payers are happy because you can also identify who you want to take the drug and that it'll be worth it. So, we've seen with gene therapy, cell therapy, and a bunch of other places that the regulators themselves are comfortable with, well-argued cases.
So, given all of this, you're talking in a way that's fairly radical for the pharma industry. And you talked about Protodigm being a CRO. It doesn't sound like most CROs I know. Do the other CROs consider you to be a CRO? And is that the right moniker for you? Or where do you fit? You're like the troublemaker sitting alone in his own spot over in the classroom, far away from everybody.
Yeah, I hope so. No, I'm reading a book at the minute about the development of piracy. Stephen Johnson is a classic innovation author, and it's really interesting the way that it looks like democracy may have come from pirates rather than the other way around. They were remarkably democratic institutions, but
yeah.
So you could find pirate ships making a big difference to democracies like the United Kingdom. I think the same thing will be true of the CRO world as well. I mean, at the moment, we're using it as a kind of placeholder name because it is clinical research, but some of it is about proof of principle, proof of concept, biomarker selection, the very early phase stuff, and we're calling it pre-decision. So before you make a decision to go to phase 2, phase 3, you do the work with us to characterize that opportunity. So CRO isn't a perfect moniker.
Pre-RO.
Yeah, pre-RO. Yeah, that's exactly. Yeah, you should copyright that.
I'll let you have it. It's like we'd like to give the guests a little gift for being on the show, so you can have that one.
Better than a mug. It's I like that. And we, the other thing is we've got a Skunk Works mindset as well, which is another term that I end up explaining because I thought everyone knew what a Skunk Works was, but it turns out they don't. So if you imagine, let's say you want to put a drug into a device and it's got a digital component and maybe a diagnostic, no pharma company in the world at the moment could build that internally and certainly do the exploration of, well, is that 2 regulatory pathways? Is it 1? What kind of commercial model would there be for that thing? And even the process, this asymmetric learning process of learning it by building it and breaking it and seeing what people think about it. That Skunk Works type approach is, it applies beautifully to this to the pre-RO world of pre-decision. Is because sometimes you can only learn by breaking things, and so I think I would position us upstream of the CROs. I think it's a mindset that pharma has lost. I think the ability to be exploratory, and I think it's a mindset that the CROs also have lost while they focus on operational standards and scale. They're fighting it out with private equity cash and all sorts of things. They're just getting bigger and bigger.
Yeah,
I think the opportunity for the mammals to come through is significant.
It's interesting. What you say about Skunk Works and it not being a term that's understood well. I remember reading a book. I think it came out around the early 1980s called "The Soul of a New Machine" by Tracy Kidder, and it was about building a computer that was a Skunk Works, kind of a classic Skunk Works project. But maybe you just hear that term used, but people don't actually have any real examples, in mind when you say it. Or
Well,
maybe you
it's
can't
it's
get away with it with everybody expected to be in Zoom meetings all day and on email and stuff like that.
well, it's I think in the tech world, people get it right. So I think
Yeah.
people are used to that idea. You know, they've seen Google X and they've seen other groups, living that idea of if you're going to do agile, it doesn't make sense to make 10,000 people try to be agile. It makes sense to at least have 20 people in a room over
Yeah.
in the car park doing it differently. And so in the tech world, I think it makes a lot of sense. I think Pharma has been, organized around different principles, been organized around silo principles and and therapeutic area franchises and so forth. So it is not a term that most folks in pharma would have come across in a day-to-day life, but I think it's one that fits really well for our approach to life.
Good. Well, it sounds like you have your hands full with these two related organizations. I see you've got some guitars or other instruments in the background there. Is that part of life as well, or what's that about?
It's I wish it was. It's I'm also a very bad guitarist. Fortunately, my son is a professional grade musician, but
Great.
I've got a record label that I run. I'm going to say in the spaces in between everything else, but that's so I tend to live my music life vicariously.
Good. What's the record label called?
It's called Medical Records. Would you
Nice.
believe?
Sure.
Yeah, so indie alternative rock with a bit of a twist. Actually built on the idea of that we would fund people's first albums, which for me are usually the best albums that anyone
Yeah.
ever makes. And if we do enough of those, the idea essentially is proof of concept is could you make album number two? Could you stay together as a band? Are you going to prove that this
Yeah.
works? So it's a little bit like a kind of exploratory record label too. But it's my wife hates it. It's the most expensive hobby I've ever had. So
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Well, you better listen to her, but I won't give any
She
specific
says
marital
that too.
advice. In terms of expenses, I know I saw early on in the pandemic when people were looking for a better Zoom background. They were like put different books and things, and sometimes the books, if you look carefully, they were kind of stupid. And I remember they had one of the bookstores around here, and I'm in the Boston area. Advertised that they would like put together a shelf of books for you. And I'm
Right.
thinking, great, I'll take a picture of that and I'll have that as my fake background. But they're like, no, you got to actually buy the books. I'm like, come on, it's just like a picture will do the job. But it looks
Yeah.
like they're real guitars there. So
Yeah.
good. All right, sounds good. Well, you mentioned one book that you enjoyed before, but any particular books that you're reading today? Anything that you would recommend to our listeners and viewers?
Wow. So if they get a chance, they should. So one thing that I do host is a farmer book club podcast. So
Yeah,
there I tend to interview the authors of books that I've found most interesting. I usually got way too many on the go. It's like four or five at a time. But if there's books that I'd recommend, um, there's a whole list there.
yeah,
One of the best books recently was The Rebel Cell by Kat Arney, which is about cancer and its development. Reading a book at the moment by actually an ex-journalist called Horatio Clare, called Heavy Light, which is his journey through psychosis and writing about that and his views on mental health and how the pharma industry interacts with that and how maybe it could improve for the better. But yeah, I know a lot on my list, and I keep
yeah.
on remembering The Enemy of All Mankind is this piracy book by Stephen Johnson. This is the one I'm sort of three-quarters of the way through, so I'm reluctant to draw all of the conclusions
Yeah,
about how pirates should organize, but it's really illuminating as most of his books are.
that's good. Well, I guess maybe it was an unfair question to ask you because if you're hosting a book club podcast, I don't want all the other authors are going to feel they were somebody was left out. I did have a guest who had been in publishing and her husband's an author and when I asked what's your favorite book, he just went right to that one, just touted his book right away and said she needs to do that. So your wife
Yeah,
may be mad at you for your hobbies, but hopefully her husband was happy for
yeah,
the promotion. Although it had nothing to do with healthcare, so I'm not sure how many readers will pick up from
yeah.
from the
It's a
podcast here.
I think it's a great time. We the reason that there's so many books, the in pile is faster than the out pile is that people keep releasing great books. So it's
It's a
it's nice to.
problem.
Well, it's a problem. It's nice to find other people to read them as well. So we've got the podcast. It's spawned a sort of actual book club out of it. So we meet monthly to review different books now as well, and then draw lessons for pharma from them. So.
Great. Well, we'll put a link in the notes here to the podcast. So Mike Ria, CEO of Idea Pharma and Protodigm, and running medical records and the book club and podcast and who knows what else. I want to say thank you very much for being on the Health Biz podcast today. I really enjoyed our conversation.
David, it's been wonderful. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to the Health Biz podcast with me, David Williams, president of Health Business Group. I conduct in-depth interviews with leaders in healthcare business and policy. If you like what you hear, go ahead and subscribe on your favorite service. While you're at it, go ahead and subscribe on your second and third favorite services as well. There's more good stuff to come, and you won't want to miss an episode. If your organization is seeking strategy consulting services in healthcare, check out our website, healthbusinessgroup.com.